The first humans to use fire could not make it. For hundreds of thousands of years, they carried it, guarded it, and begged it off the neighbors when it died. That is the part the campfire story leaves out. Fire lived in human hands long before anyone could strike it from nothing. Go to Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa. Around 1 million years ago, something was burning there, deep inside, roughly 30 meters back from the mouth, where no lightning reaches and no bushfire spreads. Ash from burned grass and leaves, splinters of bone scorched at the temperature of a campfire, not the fiercer heat of a wildfire, and you can read that heat in the color and structure of the burnt bone itself. The hands feeding that fire were almost certainly Homo erectus, an ancestor with a brain smaller than yours and a face that would stop you on the street. Move north to Gesher Benot Yaakov in Israel, closer to 800,000 years ago. Here the fire stays in one place. Burnt flint clusters in the same spots, layer over layer, dug up again and again. Not one stray blaze. The same hearth, relit in the same corner of the same camp, generation after generation. The same site turns up cracked nuts and burnt wood from several kinds of tree, which means fire and food were already sitting side by side. Someone chose that spot. Someone kept coming back to it. Keeping a fire and making one are different animals, so where did the fire come from before anyone could make it? A lightning strike in dry grass, a seam of burning coal, or a volcanic vent, a bushfire rolling through and someone desperate enough to run at it and drag out a burning branch. You take the flame the world hands you, and from then on your life is arranged around not letting it go out. Making your own on a cold morning with damp wood and nobody to help, that came later. How much later, nobody agrees, and the tools that prove it are far younger than the ash. Here is the snag that keeps the argument alive. Homo erectus already had smaller teeth and a shorter gut almost 2 million years ago, long before that ash at Wonderwerk. If cooking did the reshaping, the fires that cooked those meals should sit down there in the record too, and mostly they do not. There are older hints, patches of reddened, burnt ground at a handful of sites in Kenya and South Africa, reaching back perhaps 1.5 million years, but that evidence is thin and heavily disputed. Either fire is older than anything we have solidly dug up and the traces rotted away, or the body changed first and cooking arrived later to cash in. Careful people line up on both sides. How do you make one from nothing? Take the oldest way, the one you could manage with nothing but wood. You need a straight spindle of dried dead wood and a flat board of something softer. Not any wood will do. Green or damp wood only polishes and smokes and never catches, so everything has to be bone dry and the pairing has to be right. Cut a small notch in the board, stand the spindle in it, press your palms flat to the top, and spin. Your hands run down the shaft, pressing hard, then jump back to the top and run down again. Faster, and again. Inside a minute, your palms are hot. Inside 2, they are raw. The spinning tip grinds the board to powder, the powder darkens, and then the powder starts to smoke. The smoke is not the win. Not yet. Somewhere in that little heap of hot dust, if you did everything right, a coal is forming. An ember no bigger than a match head. And it is the most fragile thing you own. Stop too early, and it dies. Breathe on it wrong, and it dies. Now the delicate part. You tip that ember into a loose ball of the driest stuff you have. Shredded bark, dead grass, the fluff off a seed head. You lift it to your mouth and breathe. Slow and steady, straight into the coal. It glows, then fades. You breathe again. The smoke thickens and stings your eyes, and then the whole bundle catches in your hands, and you have about a second to set it down before it burns you. That is fire out of nothing. On a good day, it takes a strong, practiced person a couple of minutes. On a bad day, wet wood and cold fingers, it never comes. Later, someone works out how to loop a cord around the spindle and drive it with a bow, sawing it back and forth, sparing the palms and spinning faster. Better tool, same brutal idea. Rub 2 pieces of wood together hard enough, long enough, and one of them starts to burn. There is a second road to a flame, and it spares your hands. Strike the right 2 stones, and they throw sparks. Flint on flint will not do it. You need iron in the deal, a lump of iron pyrite, the mineral later nicknamed fool's gold. Crack flint against pyrite and tiny burning flecks of iron fly off, hot enough to light tinder if the tinder is ready. That is the catch that never leaves. The spark is small and gone in a heartbeat. If your tinder is not bone dry and fine as hair, you are making sparks in the dark for your own entertainment. People would have kept dry tinder against the body out of the rain, prepared long before the moment it was needed. It was not kindling, it was equipment. The Neanderthals may have found a shortcut. At more than one of their sites in France, people dig up small blocks of manganese dioxide, a black mineral worn down as though it was being used for something. One reading is chemistry. Manganese dioxide lowers the temperature at which wood shavings ignite and helps them keep burning, so a pinch of the black powder could turn stubborn tinder into tinder that takes a spark first try. Not everyone is convinced. The blocks might have been for coloring skin. Still, these were not simple people, and coaxing a fire to catch is exactly the sort of problem they were good at. However you got your flame, the work had only started because a fire left alone does one reliable thing. It goes out. So the fire had to be kept, and that was the real daily labor, the job that never makes it into the paintings. Through the day, you feed it. At night, you cannot let it roar while everyone sleeps, and you cannot let it die, so you bank it. You rake the hot coals into a heap and bury them under their own ash, packed down to draw a trickle of air. And no more. Done right. The coals live through the night under that gray blanket, and at dawn someone scrapes them out, lays on dry grass, and breathes the fire back to life. In many of these groups, fire was not a thing you owned. It was a thing someone was answerable for. The last one asleep and the first one up, checking the coals, because the other option was starting over from raw wood and raw hands, and in the wet season that could mean not starting at all. When a camp moved, the fire went with it. Certain bracket fungus, dried out, will hold a smolder for hours like a slow fuse, and a live coal packed in moss or bark could ride inside a horn or a lump of clay from one camp to the next. You did not stroll away from a living fire and count on finding another. You brought yours. What did all this buy that people would scorch their hands and nurse coals through the night to hold on to it? Food, first. Lay meat over a fire and the heat does the opening work of digestion for you, breaking down tough tissue your gut would fight with, so you pull more energy from the same carcass for less effort. Heat cracks open starchy roots and grains that are close to useless raw. It kills what lives in the meat as well, the parasites and the rot that a raw meal carries straight into your body. The biologist Richard Wrangham takes this the whole way. His claim is that cooking did not only feed us, it built us. Softer, richer food, he argues. Let our ancestors grow big, hungry brains while their teeth and guts shrank, since a cooked meal does not need the heavy chewing muscles and long intestines a raw one demands. A chimpanzee spends something like half its waking day chewing. Cooked food cut that down to a sliver and handed the hours back. Plenty of researchers push back, mostly over timing, over whether fire was routine early enough to have done the job. The core of it is hard to shake. We are the animal that handed part of its digestion to a fire. The rest of what fire gave is plainer and just as large. Heat in a world that kept sliding into ice ages. Ice Age Europe was survivable with a fire and lethal without one, and warmth let people live where winter would otherwise kill them. Light, which dragged the day out past sundown and won back hours that used to belong to the dark. Work that needed both hands and decent light could carry on after it, mending, napping stone, stripping bark. There was also the matter of what moved in that dark. A lion or a hyena, happy to take a sleeping human, keeps its distance from open flame. You would see the eyes at the edge of the firelight and nothing closer. For the first time, the night had a wall around it, and the wall was fire. The fire also changed what happened after dark. The anthropologist Polly Wiesner spent years among the Juhoansi of the Kalahari, tracking what people talked about by day and by firelight. Daytime talk ran practical and often sour. Who owed what? Who had wronged whom? The grind of getting through the day. After dark, around the fire, more than 8 in 10 conversations turned into stories. Of distant kin, of the dead, of people and places over the horizon. A single fire drew a scattered group into one ring, faces lit, the meal coming off the same coals. Firelight opened the hours where a group did its dreaming. Fire even sharpened the weapons. Hold the point of a wooden spear near the coals, close but out of the flame, and the heat drives the water out of the wood and hardens it, so the tip bites deeper and holds its edge longer. A stick turns into a spear because someone learned to cook the end of it. Then the rain came in sideways for 3 days, and the coals finally went black and cold. Once you could make fire from nothing, a cold hearth stopped being a disaster. It came back down to 2 pieces of wood, a notch, and a pair of hands that already knew exactly how much this was going to hurt. An hour of hard work, and sore hands at the end of it,